Making Engagement Meaningful with P2 Toolkits. We're super excited to welcome you all to today's learning webinar. So on behalf of IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and our colleagues IAP2 Australasia, a very, very big welcome. We're really thrilled today. We've got participants from all over Canada, all over the United States, and in Australia, and also very early in New Zealand. So welcome, welcome, welcome. This is super exciting. We are following up on our series right now of bringing back some great conference sessions from Montreal. And certainly our three presenters today had the opportunity, well, at least two of them had the opportunity to present in Montreal. They're making engagement meaningful with P2 Toolkit. So we're super pumped about this. So thank you. We're going to continue to bring you some more from the Montreal conference, as well as in the next little while we're going to be focusing in on some of our Core Value Award winners as we head towards our Core Value Awards application process, which will be happening in late March. But right now, back to today's session. So before we get started, Drew, I'm going to get you unmuted. You housekeeping items, please.
And there's just a few things to talk about, Amelia. There's, for example, this is a very interactive session, so we encourage you to take part. There's ways you can ask questions. You can use the question box and type them into the chat box there, and then Amelia will break in when it's appropriate and ask the question for you. There's also our way of asking questions by raising your hand, little hand icon that you see up on your screen there. You can click on that, and that will indicate to Amelia that you want to actually ask the question yourself, and then we can unmute your microphone and you can ask the question. Speaking of muting microphones, everybody is muted right now. So if you've muted yourself, please take yourself off mute, and we'll control when your mic is open and so forth. We keep everybody muted because that way we don't get feedback or strange echoes and that sort of thing. It can be very distracting. The other thing that we've got for interaction is the polls, and there will be some poll questions asked throughout the presentation, and so please take part in that. It's a good way to keep you involved. Also, it helps our presenters know exactly whom they are presenting to. This session is being recorded, and so we will have the link to that recording posted for you within about 24 hours, and we'll send that link around to you along with any collateral material such as the PowerPoint deck that they're using. Actually, it's Google Slides this time, but you know what I mean. And other things that they may have. They may have some links to some projects that they've been working on. We'll send those around to you as well. And also there's a survey that we'll send you afterwards. It just gives an idea for some general feedback on how this webinar went. And it helps us to continue improving the webinars because they've grown more and more popular over the past couple of years. We want to keep it that way as well. So with that, I'm going to hand this back to Amelia, and we'll get this show started.
Well, thanks very much, Drew. And as Drew's mentioned, we do want this to be interactive. So please, if you've got questions or comments or feedback, let us know. Send it in through the chat box or through the question box, or raise your hand. So with that, I get the great opportunity to introduce Christelle, Abby, and Zane, who will be our presenters today. So I'm going to kickstart with Christelle and then go through. So Christelle Blackford is a public involvement and digital engagement specialist with over 10 years experience blending community outreach, user research, and evaluation best practices across sectors. Drawing on her experience as a planning and community engagement consultant and affordable housing practitioner and her many years at Google, she brings an interdisciplinary approach to designing equitable processes that build public trust and contribute to sustainable decision-making. Christelle has a Master's of Community Development from University of California, Davis. Abby Monroe is a coordinating planner for the City of Chicago's Department of Planning and Development, playing a lead role on a variety of Chicago's planning initiatives related to historical preservation, equitable development, cultural programming, and more. She is an IAP2 trained, multi-scale community planner with extensive experience designing comprehensive public engagement programs to support long-range planning initiatives. As a facilitator, Abby uses innovative techniques to engage audiences of all sizes in conversations about land use, transportation, community health, and sustainability. Abby earned her bachelor's from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and like Christelle, has her master's in community development from UC Davis. Zane Ham is a dynamic leader and educator with more than 2 decades of strategic and practical experience in various sectors, particularly community-engaged research, fund development, and innovative communication strategies. Building on civic storytelling, knowledge of emerging practices, and dialogue between generations, Zane bridges public and private sector interests for continuous learning and evaluation. Zane has a PhD in educational policy and was a founding researcher with the Centre for Public Involvement in Edmonton, Alberta. And last fall, Zane led a new process of mapping community leadership for the Council Initiative on Public Engagement. And she currently leads the process design for the Multicultural Health Brokers Cooperative Research on Housing and Poverty, bringing together university, community, and government partners. Well, as you can probably tell from these great bios, we have really well experienced presenters today, Drews. So if you can please hand the screen over to Christelle, and we're going to get going. So Christelle,
right, thank you so much,
welcome.
Amelia.
Excellent.
Thank you. Can you see my screen with the
We sure can.
up?
Hello, my name is. Excellent, all yours.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're really excited to have this opportunity to share the session that we did in Montreal with more people. And really we're gonna talk to you today about public participation toolkits, and we really want to use this also as a two-way opportunity for learning and information exchange. So we look forward to hearing your questions and any experiences that you have using public participation toolkits as well. So thank you, Amelia, for the introductions. I'm just going to give a little bit more detail and provide some context that will be helpful for understanding our presentation. When we put this presentation together, Abby and I were actually working together as part of the community engagement and facilitation team at Michael Baker International. And so 2 of the projects we're going to share with you today are from that time when we were working together. And so even though we don't work together now, I just wanted to provide that so you kind of understand where we're coming from. And then I actually met Zane at the IAP2 conference in 2015 in Portland. And so I'm just really excited that we've been able to connect across from the United States to Canada and connect about toolkits and share best practices, and we've been really excited about her application of toolkits as well. So again, I'm Christelle. I'm with Civic Makers, which is an engagement and innovation firm based out of San Francisco. And what we do is we partner with public sector organizations and institutions to advance human-centered and collaborative problem solving. And we do that through education, consultation, and the cultivation of what we call a community of practice. And if you're interested, we actually have a newsletter that you can subscribe to if you go to civicmakers.com and keep up to date on all things civic innovation. So there's my little pitch for you before we get started. So jumping right in, what on earth is a public participation toolkit, or P2 toolkit for short, which is quite a mouthful? We define these as a P2 toolkit as something that empowers those who don't regularly do community outreach, and that could be community members or agency staff even, by providing them with a useful framework that allows those folks to design an outreach program, conduct the outreach, and then report back on key topics. And I want to point out that a P2 toolkit is not simply just a set of materials created to do outreach. It's really specifically designed as a way to hand over the outreach process to the group that you want to engage, but still providing a mechanism to support them through that process. So when is a toolkit useful? There's several situations, more than are on this slide, when it could be useful, but these are a couple of things to consider, and there might be multiple of these happening at once. So one would be when you have a motivated bunch of community members, be that community groups, committee members, even agency staff, that are really excited about contributing to the outreach process, but they need some additional guidance. It's also useful when you have limited project budget, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and you recognize that if you are able to engage the community to extend your outreach reach, that you'll be able to engage far more people than the limited staff capacity or budget that you may have. Also, it's good to keep in mind that some projects, in some situations, your project team might be more or less open to this kind of an approach, which is a little bit of a new approach to some people, and so sort of building trust in that process might be important, or you might have a project team that's really all about trying new things. And then finally, when you have a community that maybe doesn't trust your process and they're doubting whether or not the way that you're going about outreach is really reliable and credible, and you can use toolkits to give them ownership over the process, and this really helps to build trust. So the key components of a P2 toolkit process are, as we think of them, and I think that lots of folks have done these in many different ways, so as I said before, really excited to hear from you all about what you've done. But the way we think of this process is involving some kind of actual toolkit, and that can be physical or it can be digital, but it's some kind of compendium of resources. Secondly, a guide to the suggested process, and that will include some kind of associated collateral materials such as worksheets or templates or even design prompts if you're having folks design their own outreach process. Some kind of training is always important to get everyone on the same page about how to use the toolkit, and then an ongoing system of support by the public participation professional so that you can be there to answer questions and provide guidance throughout the process. And then finally, and I think maybe most importantly, some kind of mechanism for the input that's gathered to be compiled in a consistent way and transmitted back to the project team so that you're sure that you're sharing the outcomes with the decision makers, and that those that community process is really honored and respected as real data. So now we're going to do a quick poll. And I think that I hand it over to Drew to do this.
Yep, there it's up. Thanks, Christelle. So have you ever used a P2 toolkit? Yes or no? So if everyone could please respond to that. And Drew, I think we're going to close it up. And so the answer, Christelle, is 41% have used a toolkit and 59% have not. So 41% are a yes and 59% a no. Back to you.
All right, that's great to know. I'm glad to hear that we have a good mix on the line, and excited to hear from those folks that have used P2 toolkits for how they went about doing that. And I think that just to set a little context, I want to sort of put everyone, whether or not you've used a P2 toolkit or not, imagine a time, I'm sure that all of you can probably think of a time when you felt that other people besides yourself, even though you were the public participation practitioner or specialist, were kind of better positioned for one reason or the other to conduct outreach. And maybe that's because they're embedded community members that are embedded in a specific community that you felt like you didn't have those personal relationships, or people that had more capacity, or people that had cultural competence that you didn't have, or language knowledge that you didn't have. And so, any time that you find yourself in that kind of situation, we think toolkits are really a great way to empower those people that are better suited to the outreach in that particular moment to conduct meaningful outreach, even though you're the one that's bringing the best practices, and the toolkit is really what's enabling you to support the process and make that process really as valuable as the outcomes themselves. So now we're going to jump into sharing 3 case studies with you, and then we're going to discuss the insights that we gained from these projects, and open it up to questions at the very end. So the first 2 projects are projects that Abby and I worked on together, and then the third is Zane's project. And so I'm just going to jump right in here. Our first project took place in the city of Elk Grove, and it was in a rural community, and it was outreach about mobility. So, you know, getting around town, and specifically focused on getting around town without a car. So a little bit about this project and the situation in which this project arose. So Elk Grove, just for context, is a suburban community. It's outside of Sacramento, California. And it has, even though it's suburban, it has this one section of town that's a kind of a unique rural area. And this area feels particularly threatened by the suburban development that's happening all around it. The rural community there has a long history of working with the city and collaborating to make sure that their voice is heard to protect their rural way of life, despite this continued development and growth in the rest of the city. And the point that we were starting this project, some of that long history had started to break down, and there was a little bit of lack of trust developing between the community and the city. The community makeup was really shifting from being folks that had lived there for a long time and really, you know, were wanting to protect their rural way of life, and some newer community members that, you know, were younger, had children, wanted to bring some of the things that they saw in the rest of the community with them to the rural area, particularly sidewalks, bike lanes, trails, and they saw that as, you know, an improvement. But the long-standing community really felt that those changes would ruin the rural aesthetic, and they were worried it'd be the beginning of the end to their rural bastion. So we decided to apply a toolkit approach after the first community meeting that we did showed a total 50-50 split in opinion, and people really didn't trust the process. A lot of people felt that the community meeting, although it was relatively well attended, was not really a true indicator of the community preferences. And they felt that there was a need to talk to every community member, not just about the rural area as a whole, but really about every specific street segment. So every section of street that was being considered for any kind of mobility improvement. And so as you can imagine, we thought, well, that's a fantastic idea, but we're not sure that we have the capacity to do that kind of extensive outreach. But we had a bunch of passionate folks from the 2 rural neighborhood associations who really wanted to help by conducting door-to-door surveys. And we quickly recognized that they would do a much better job because they would also be much better received by their neighbors. You know, they were known faces in town, and this is a place that can kind of be hostile to outsiders. So having us as outsiders knock on doors maybe would not have been very well received at all, which is also a good argument for engaging this group of community members who are eager to help out. So what we did is we put together a toolkit, and here's a photo of what it looked like. You know, it's a pretty basic cardboard box with some printed materials in there. And what we included was the project information, so some background information about how the project came to be, and the timeline, and some outcomes from the last community meeting. We had a bunch of resources, such as maps showing each street segment, the exact location of the public right-of-way, which people were really concerned to know about, and the easements and property lines, so that people could get really clear on if they were to add a sidewalk, exactly where would it fit. And there were also a lot of interest in understanding how that would affect the native trees in the area. Then we also had a set of templates that were for conducting door-to-door surveys and you know, determining the real level of interest in any kind of mobility improvements, and also templates for conducting and hosting community meetings. We suggested a timeline and a schedule of activities, and we also included, most importantly, reporting back forms so that all of the data collected would be tabulated in the same way, and so that it could really hold water. And then finally, all of those fun Post-it notes and pens and clipboards and name tags that are always good to have in an outreach toolkit. So the toolkit results. We hosted an orientation meeting and recruited 10 street teams to own each street segment that was a candidate for mobility improvements. And most of the street team survey groups did door-to-door surveys. A few of them did community meetings. So they kind of took our templates and adapted them to what worked for them. And we held regular check-in calls to answer any of their questions and support them through the process. At one point, folks requested additional maps, and we provided those. And in the end, our volunteers engaged over 115 households on a one-on-one basis, which is, much more than we would have been able to do ourselves, and was much better received by the community. When we conducted exit interviews with the participants, everyone was really largely satisfied with the process and the results. The community decided to, in the end, focus on roadway safety as a first step instead of moving to mobility improvements. So there was a lot of concern about the speed of traffic on the roadways and various intersections that they felt were unsafe. And then there was only one road that was nominated for some minor mobility improvements, and that was close to the school. And in the end, the outcome was that the relationship between the community and the city, which, as I said, had soured a little bit at that point, was restored in this new way. And people really felt like they had trust and that their city was really listening to them and really hearing their preferences, because they had been able to take over that process and own it. And they trusted that themselves and their neighbors were, were really doing the outreach in the way that they felt was important to do it. So we consider that a great success, and of course there's lessons learned, which I'll get into when we get into the discussion phase, but I want to hand it over now to Abby to talk to us about the City of West Hollywood.
And so, Christelle, perhaps just before you hand it over, just a couple of questions.
Sure.
How did you, not hire, but how did you bring the volunteers into the process? Was there any media involvement? And did you talk to people that hadn't been part of the one-on-one interviews, but perhaps talked to their friends and so knew about it? So might not have been as engaged, but was there a broader evaluation that people knew what was going on and what was happening and they were okay with the process? So how did you recruit? Was there any media involvement? And beyond the 115 households, was there any comments?
Great. Those are great questions. So the way that we recruited was, so we had a couple of really active participants from the very beginning, even when we were just doing community meetings and the community wasn't really trusting the process, that were from these really well-organized neighborhood associations. And so they actually, we coordinated with a core group of them, and then they recruited further volunteers from their pool of neighbors. And for context, this is a small area, relatively small area, and the community is basically split. The rural area is basically split in half, and each segment is covered by one of those neighborhood associations. So everyone was either part of one or the other neighborhood association. So I think we got a little lucky there in terms of recruiting for volunteers, although we did have one or two segments that nobody was really stepping up for, and we had one team cover several segments. But that was sort of a natural understanding that, okay, this part of the road people aren't that concerned about. No one was really feeling that passionate about it, so that was also good information to have. Media, no. It's not much of that particular area, I think, has a low tolerance for media. When we've done other work in that city, we've done press releases and digital news ads and things like that, but not for this particular community. And then can you tell me the final question again?
Sure. The third question was there a broader consensus other than the 115 people, 115 households? You know,
Yeah.
because we're all well aware that people talk to neighbors and things, but they might not participate. So just wondering whether or not the grapevine was alive and well on this one.
Yeah, so the 115 households actually covered almost probably about 95% of the houses directly on the street segments of interest. So it was really close to 100% participation. We did host a community meeting at the conclusion to share the outcome of the toolkit outreach process, and then we invited folks at that community meeting to discuss the results and really tell us, you know, are there any concerns? Is this this is the final result we're making to council based on the data that you all collected? Does this ring true for you? And we had a discussion, and we actually made a minor modification to the final set of recommendations that we gave to council at the end. And so the people, you know, in that room, I think mostly participated in conducting the outreach, but there are other people in the room that were from the broader community.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Abby now.
All right, thank you, Christelle. So as was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is a project from my previous life as a consultant in California working on public engagement programs for cities and counties statewide. And in particular, I worked for the city of Hollywood in a lot of different contexts. This is one of the more interesting projects that I got to participate in. And for those that don't know, the city of West Hollywood is a very creative and innovative city, and so as they were approaching this understanding of needing to develop a strategic communications and community engagement plan for the city, they really did a great job, in my opinion, of thinking outside the box and recognizing that just writing a basic plan would probably end up sitting on the shelf and not be extremely useful for the folks that were most intended to use it, and so they actually chose to do a toolkit process instead of just your traditional planning document. So if Christelle, you could go to the next slide. So they had three primary goals in sort of initiating this process. They wanted to make sure that city staff, and so this particular toolkit application is a little bit different than the example that Christelle just spoke about, because ultimately the audience was city staff themselves, and so the communications department wanted to make sure that City Hall staff had an approachable roadmap and different tools that they could use that were readily accessible on their desktops to make sure that they were always following the protocols for different communications methodologies and other types of branding. And every time the staff person would speak to a community member, that they felt supported in having sort of a more uniform conversation across all of the city departments. And so there were approximately 250 people that they had in mind, sort of the department leads that often have exposure to working directly with the public, that they wanted to make sure were trained as a part of this strategic plan. And again, like I said, they wanted to make sure it was really exciting and useful and not something that, you know, everyone would go through the training and then just forget about. Next slide, please. So like I said, in this particular situation, many of the departments had a public-facing role, and I'm not sure why the graphics aren't showing up. Christelle, maybe you could advance. There we go. There's some imagery on this slide that just demonstrates the diversity of materials that were being produced by different West Hollywood departments. And the communications department really recognized the need for consistency across all of their public-facing materials. And so that was really the main motivation for using the toolkit approach, was to give people a readily accessible reference a set of reference materials so that they could, when they're creating a poster or creating an email or a newsletter or just even a project fact sheet, that they were sort of all referencing the same style guides and city values in terms of messaging and things like that. So this particular toolkit was sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from the Elk Grove Rural Roads toolkit that you just heard about because it was very highly designed. The city brought in an outside graphic designer to help them put together all of these different ideas into a really very visually appealing package. The toolkit itself included several booklets that speak to different things like communications, branding, community engagement, and then there are also several posters that, so in addition to having these little reference booklets, you could take the posters out and actually hang them around your cubicle, and they were really attractive to look at, and they included information about demographics in West Hollywood, and lots of other data points that are helpful when you're composing messaging to the public. And then lastly, they included these little, they're not exactly playing cards, but they had different community engagement strategies on cardstock cards that you could use when you're sitting down with your team to begin thinking through what type of community engagement is appropriate for the project you're about to initiate. You can take these cards out and say, I don't know, should we consider going on WeHo TV? Should we do a survey? Should we do a fact sheet? And there were sort of just tips and best practices for each of those types of engagement strategies that the city supported, so that you as the project manager and your department, could have that information right at your fingertips rather than having to go and meet with communications and figure out who's, able to give you that information. Next slide. And so it was a really interesting process. I think city staff were really appreciative of the communications department giving them this, these guidelines for community engagement and communications. They were really proud to put the toolkits on their desks. They're very attractive, kind of fun materials to engage with. And then they felt like they had a real common language to begin talking. So I noticed that after each of the training sessions, they were like, oh, well, now we can really use these tools to improve this project or this project. There's a lot of enthusiasm. People felt like they were better able to communicate with each other about what community engagement is, elements that could improve the programs that they were already working on. And there's just a real increased curiosity and excitement about doing engagement in the future. And the city did conduct sort of basic feedback survey and noticed that there were 15% rise in workflow requests, so communications division certainly got quite busy after releasing this toolkit. 87% of the staff members who went through the training felt that the toolkit would be useful. And they really felt that having gone through the training, and even I think probably since this time have gone through subsequent training, really helpful in not just receiving the toolkit, but actually walking through each component of it and understanding how to use it properly. And I think that's the last slide for that project, so now I'll turn it over to Zane.
Thank you, Abby. Go ahead, Zane.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk about the DIY Engage toolkit that was created through a partnership between the Centre for Public Involvement in Edmonton, Alberta, and the University of Alberta. And the Centre for Public Involvement, for those of you who don't know, is a formal partnership between the University of Alberta, so a university academic partnership with the City of Edmonton, so a municipal governance and academic partnership. So if we could move to the first slide, I'll talk a little bit about the project. So our intention was really to design with intention a resource that was accessible to anyone, whether you're planning a youth engagement event or gathering feedback from community members or designing a process to have a conversation between generations, something that could be an entry point for conversation, start to generate enthusiasm and excitement for thinking about diversity and inclusion in very intentional ways, from planning, implementation, right through to evaluation of processes. And the idea behind it is that it's a process that could be facilitated by anyone in familiar community spaces and to think through culturally appropriate contexts and points for inclusion. So as was mentioned earlier by Christelle, the toolkit was designed to support both the process and the outcomes of engagement and participation. So the idea of being able to share unique perspectives and insights, engaging in an experiential learning simulation activity to spark dialogue, and to really think about practical ways to address barriers and enhance engagement. And further to that, really developing relationships and partnerships within the community while having a guided conversation. The next slide. So the design was intended to be built on timely and highly relevant scholarly research and concepts, so to have solid content, and then also the interactive tools and materials for anyone doing engagement work. So that included a conversation blueprint, deck of challenge cards, so thinking about barriers on the one side, and then on the other side, a set of potential responses or solutions, and a set of buttons designed to encourage different kinds of perspectives and shifts in thinking. So the whole process was designed to think about creative thinking and responses to some of the toughest challenges. Slide. So we had an opportunity to test the toolkits with an audience at the IAP2 International in Portland, and also through various classroom and community-based settings. So I had the opportunity to use the toolkit for conversation in a graduate, undergraduate, university course called Imagining Cities, and all of the students were also practitioners or community leaders in their own context, and really interested in experiential learning and opportunities to practice and think through some of the toughest challenges in making participation accessible and civic conversations that are diverse and inclusive. The latest version of the toolkit is being developed in concert with a group of high school leadership students, and they're working on a simplified game format. So I'll talk more about that during our key insights portion of our conversation this afternoon. But this range of audiences and approaches to gaining feedback and how the toolkit can be used is a key part to getting feedback and strengthening the design and usability of the resource.
All right. Thank you so much, Zane. Now we have another poll question for everyone out there. So we're asking, oh, go ahead, Amelia.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. So the poll question's up there, and what components of our P2 toolkits would resonate most with your community? So there's a number of different examples up there, so we'll just ask you to select one of those, and we're going to close this up. We're going to close it up now, Drew. Hopefully everyone's responded. So the answers, Christelle and Abby and Zane, are portable toolkit at 9%, accessible online at 53%, a how-to guide at 32%, a focus on equity and inclusivity at 6%, and there's nothing there for other. So 9, 53, 32, and 6%. Back to you.
All right, great. I like to see that folks are supportive of having things accessible online. I know that's become more and more important today. And of course, how-to guides, I think there's any number of formats that could take. So we also welcome folks sharing examples that they've used as we go through these key insights. So we're gonna just kind of take turns sharing some takeaways that we had from our experience using these toolkits, and like I said, welcome folks to chime in, ask questions, or contribute their own thoughts about experiences that they've had. So I'm going to hand it to Abby to talk about this first key insight.
Sure, thanks, Christelle. So the first question we were planning to answer here is, what did you learn from watching people interact with your toolkit, and what part of the toolkit proved to be most valuable? And I think in the case of West Hollywood communication strategic plan in particular, it was clear that had the materials just been done as sort of like your traditional planning document or with less emphasis on graphic design, that it would not have resonated as much with city staff as it did. And I know that that's not always an option for practitioners because of budget reasons and even just time and energy. But I do think in this particular case, because the communications department put so much energy into making this a really easy to use and visually appealing set of materials, that was more, the city staff was more interested in actually putting it into practice. Christelle or Zane, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, for Elk Grove, I think what I would add is that we found that our toolkit was maybe, even though it was pretty, straightforward in the way that we compiled all the information, that it might have been too heavy-handed in its instructional nature, and that we could have made it a little bit simpler and allowed a little bit more opportunity for people to adapt it to kind of suit their needs. And it was an example of, this in this particular community, making it, very unlike West Hollywood, kind of like the simpler the better, very low design was good, but what we could have done is just really made it shorter, and we saw people getting a little bit lost with the large amounts of information. Did you want to add anything to that, Zane?
I think that sums it up. Keeping it simpler and having different ways that it can be adapted.
Mm-hmm. Great.
We have a quick question from Dylan.
Yeah.
Dylan's asking, did you have any issue, particularly in Elk Grove, with Toolkit users skewing the data or trying to influence either the results based on personal opinion? I could see the project sponsors being nervous about this potential.
Yes, great question, and we had the same question in Montreal, and definitely a concern, and definitely something that we were, doing our best to control for. And we did see one particular participant from one of the neighborhood groups that was a volunteer that was very sort of adamant about her opinion, and we did get some data from her that we could tell was her writing in the same thing over and over again. And so in that particular case, that was the only, because we had kind of personal relationships with these folks, and we were checking in with them weekly, and we were really getting to know them on a personal level, I think that, we understood what was going on in that situation. I think that it's just so contextual and can be really different in different situations. And I think the way that to deal with that is totally different in different situations. And so in this particular case, it was sort of, we were able to identify it just based on interacting with this person and then seeing the way that they were sharing some of their results with us. So that can definitely be a tricky part of this, of using toolkits. Okay, so we'll move on to the next insight. What made the toolkit approach successful, and how did you measure success? So, I think that what really made the toolkit approach successful in Elk Grove was the fact that we got higher quality feedback than the city would have been able to collect on their own without these volunteers, because people were able to really go and have these one-on-one conversations and talk specifically about these very particular street segments instead of having a general conversation about the whole rural area. And also just the fact that this group of community members, and then by extension the folks that they talked to, really felt like they were getting some ownership over the process, and were intimately familiar with sort of the feedback and the recommendations that were being made in a way that made them feel really comfortable with the process, because they had gone out and done it on their own. We measured success by, we were paying attention to the number of surveys that were collected, the sort of depth of feedback that was provided on each one. As I mentioned before, we did some exit interviews, and the main indicator in the end was really the fact that we had broad-based support for the process and the outcomes that resulted from this process. Zane, did you have something to add to that?
I think seeing people actively participate in the process and provide ongoing feedback and ideas is also a measure of the success, that it begins an interactive conversation that's ongoing and extends beyond the time period when the toolkit is being used. I think is a huge indicator of the kind of change that it can spark.
Yeah. Definitely. Are there any comments or questions on that one, or did you have anything to add, Abby, or should we move to the next?
So there's a couple of questions here. You've all talked about the design of your toolkits and how they've all been done slightly differently. Just wondering whether or not you brought the people you wanted to engage into the design. Like, did you talk to them? Did you focus group it? Did you do any interviews first before you actually designed the toolkit so that you could hear directly from them as to what they thought might play within their publics? And the second question is, can we hear a little bit more about the train-the-trainer process and how important and relevant it might be?
Yeah, great questions. So I'll start with the first question for Elk Grove. We, like I said, we had that core group of volunteers from the neighborhood associations that then went out and helped us recruit additional volunteers. And we actually met with them when we were coming up with the idea to do a toolkit and sort of asked them, what do you think? Is this a good approach? Got their initial buy-in, and then we, you know, sort of brainstormed with them what the toolkit should look like, came up with some ideas, got their input, and so it was an iterative design process with that core group of people, but not everybody that ultimately participated in the outreach. Zane or Abby?
This is Zane. I can comment about the prototype that we had it for our workshop session in IAP2 in Portland. We were asking participants about the design, feedback on the content, and ease of use. And so we did get a range of feedback and ideas from that session, which were really helpful. And it also helped us to understand we needed to be really clear about the purpose, and that on the one hand, it's great if it can be used in different ways with different audiences, and on the other hand, we were cautioned not to try to do too much or to be really clear with what the intention was. So while the challenge cards, for example, can stand alone and help feed a conversation, just as an example in a meeting kind of setting, there's also an opportunity to do a full-on simulation game and process design, which requires more time and training, if you will, or opportunity to really engage deeply with the resource. So that feedback was really valuable, and also leads to other questions about you know, design and purpose.
Thank you, Zane. Yeah, and this is Christelle, and I was part of that session, and I thought that was a fantastic idea to, you know, use a conference session as a design collaboration process. It was really getting input from folks all over the globe. Abby, do you want to speak to the train-the-trainer question?
Yeah, sure, and I'll just add to that last question too, that I don't think in the case of West Hollywood a whole lot of outreach was done to city staff before the toolkit was designed, but they did base it off of the IAP2 approach to community engagement, at least that section of the booklet. And so I think it's really important also to think about if you're, you know, in a city department, there are a lot of resources out there that have done a lot more vetting of, you know, the recommendations that they're putting forth, so you can kind of borrow from those ideas as you think about your own toolkits. And sorry, what was the second question?
So the second,
go ahead.
The second question was really about the importance of sort of the train-the-trainer. All three of you talked about that, and how relevant is it? How important is it?
I think it's, at least in the case of Elk Grove and West Hollywood, it was pretty much fundamental to the success of the project. I think that, in my opinion, you know, the toolkits themselves, in some ways, can stand alone if you have really explicit instructions that are, you're able to download with the toolkit. But there's something really nice about sort of the face-to-face interaction of an actual training session to help people really understand like what the toolkit is and what all the different components are. And I think especially if you're using them in a community where the information or the process itself is a new idea, going through that in a more detailed way is really important rather than just handing over the toolkit and saying, okay, here's everything you need. And in West Hollywood in particular, I think that city staff needed to feel that sort of momentum and seriousness behind the that sort of rolling out of the communications plan. So they really appreciated the trainings. They felt included in the process at that stage and really empowered, I think, to use the toolkit on their own going forward, but sort of needed that higher level training to get started.
So did any of you continue on with coaching as people got out into the field and started delivering the toolkits, or was just the initial training session, did that work?
Yeah, so in the case of Elk Grove, we did check in monthly with our volunteer teams and really acted as a coach the entire time that they were out in the field doing outreach. With West Hollywood, the check-ins are sort of more on like a project-by-project basis. So the communications department, after the trainings then said, we're available to you to continue this conversation. When you have a project, you can come to us and we'll use the toolkit together to design strategies for your communications materials or an outreach program. And so in that case, they were definitely planning to play an ongoing coaching role, after the toolkit trainings took place.
Well, you're obviously generating a lot of excitement out there because people are asking whether or not they can get hold of your toolkits. So, so I know people want to see whether or not
the
they
West
can.
Hollywood one should be online. If you'll give me a minute, I can try to find the direct link, but I'm sure in the communications section there's a link to download it.
Great. And what we will do after today's session, when we send out the recording, we'll also be sending out the PowerPoint and any other materials. So just so that people know, whatever we can get from these ladies, we'll include in the materials that we send out. So back to you guys.
All right, thank you. So we're going to thank you all for the great questions and keep them coming. And also if folks have any responses to these questions for toolkits you've used yourself, we'd love to hear those. So I'm going to pass it to Abby to answer this next question. What motivated your participants to support a toolkit process?
Sure. I touched on this a little bit already, but I think the primary thing is that people don't like to feel confused or that they don't have the right tools to do a good job. And so the city, in this case, kind of in West Hollywood's case, recognized that not only are they sort of streamlining and coordinating communications across the city, but they're also really supporting staff to do the best job that they possibly can. And the idea is that inevitably interactions with the public will be smoother, more productive, and more positive so that the city as a whole does a better job of engagement on everything that they do. And so I think city staff want to get to that place, and so they were really excited to have a very concrete methodology and set of tools to help them do a better job in those cases rather than feeling completely out on their own to figure it out themselves.
Yeah, and I think in the case of Elk Grove, the community was really eager to do this outreach, but I think that they realized that they didn't know exactly how to start, and so they appreciated that we were providing them with a framework that they could then apply to do what they wanted to do. So it was really about, for them, the toolkit was just a means to the ends of something that they already were eager to do, which was go door to door and talk to their neighbors and really understand to get to the bottom of the question that we were posing to the community.
Yeah, and sorry, just to follow up, Amelia, I did just chat you the link to download the West Hollywood Toolkit if anyone's interested in that. If you go to that link at the bottom of the page, it'll take you to a Dropbox folder where you can actually get all of the files.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for that, Abby. And I just want to remind other people, apparently 40% of you have also used Toolkits. So as Christelle and Abby and Zane are looking at these questions, don't hesitate to give your own thoughts as well about what you've done.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amelia. So this question already came up, and we'll speak to it a little bit more detail. I'm going to hand it to Zane to address the question of, did you feel that the data collected was reliable?
So I'll speak more about the process in terms of a collaborative design and the interactions that we had with other practitioners. For us, the input on design and the content and ease of use or ideas for other uses was extremely beneficial in guiding further development and thinking about the toolkit. In terms of using the toolkit as a conversation guide around a specific theme or issue, that hasn't been the intent of the DIY toolkit in the ways that we've been using it so far. But the data process in terms of people talking about their own engagement and how they are either challenged or responding to key challenges in specifically diversity and inclusion, and that includes working with ethnocultural communities, working across ages, working across experiences, working with people with different types of abilities and knowledge and skills. Those kinds of generative conversations and the content from that has also been really valuable in terms of thinking about engagement processes more broadly. But ours was different from the other two examples in that it wasn't data collected specifically about levels of agreement or around a particular theme or issue. It was more about the use of the toolkit for designing an engagement process.
Mm-hmm.
So the others may have other information to add about the actual content or data in terms of reliability or credibility.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Zane. I think it'll be really fantastic to also be able to see how, as your toolkit continues to be developed and more folks apply it, you know, what results come out of that process. And I think the power of the toolkit that you have is that it's about really empowering the folks that are engaging with it to design a process that's going to work for everyone involved and really have that sort of trust in the process from the beginning because it's designed by those people. I think that that was a lesson from Elk Grove, is that even though we did collaborate with community members sort of to iterate on the design of it, we realized that, you know, maybe we could have given them a little bit more, you know, oversight or input on exactly how the toolkit ended up. Like we would have made it a little bit more straightforward and streamlined and simplified if we would have had more time to collaborate with them, because we saw after a while of people using it that maybe they were a little confused by it. It's also the particular population that we were interacting with were mostly retirees, and it was just like a different perspective than maybe we were bringing, even though we were collaborating with some of them. In terms of the reliability, I spoke to this already a little bit, but you know, we did see that overall, even though we did have that one participant that maybe was actively trying to skew the data a little bit, we overall, even though some of the people involved did have their own opinions about how the outcome should be, they really, by and large, took their roles as these outreach coordinators very seriously, and they were, you know, they really wanted to. They genuinely wanted to go out and hear what their neighbors had to say. We didn't see anyone kind of like discarding large amounts of data or anything like that. So the next question, unless there's any more questions from the audience or thoughts that anyone wants to contribute at this time, Amelia?
Nope, no questions from the audience at the moment, so we'll just keep going.
Okay, so I think that here's one, how would you redesign your toolkit? And I think I already spoke to this a little bit, for rural roads, you know, we had a lot of paper, a lot of instructions, and maybe I think if we did it again, we would have kind of simplified it, streamlined it, and allowed it to be a little bit more flexible so that those folks engaging in the process could have kind of taken some basic guidelines and adapted them. I think that the most important part to have is just making sure that all the data collected is, like I said, being reported back in a streamlined way. But the way that it's collected maybe can be a little bit more open. So that's how I would redesign. Zane or Abby?
This is Zane. I can speak to that as well. I think having an opportunity to do a little bit less explaining how to use it and set the stage to jump right in and test it. So one of the biggest challenges is that it's one of many projects, and so a possible response is one that's being worked on right now with the leadership students, new, simpler game format that can reach an audience in a more immediate and different kind of way, and there's renewed interest to support and test it using students to think about the most effective design. One of the original concepts that we liked were the challenge cards, and to be able to think about challenges and responses, and also the idea of the board game and being able to do different tasks and shift perspectives was also, we got a lot of really positive feedback about that. So part of it is thinking about how to maybe an approach where you do have one option if it's a full day activity or simulation and process that is guided, but also to have a simpler game format you can just jump right in and use in a shorter session. So those are two sort of lines of thought right now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Go ahead, Amelia.
Sorry, thanks. Thanks very much. I actually need to make a big apology to the group because I thought I had managed to copy and paste the link that Abby had sent, and apparently I've sent you a completely different link. So my apologies for that to anyone that's clicked on that link. Please know that we will be sending you out the correct links when Drew sends everything out. So my apologies for that to anybody that opened it up and goes, why am I seeing something about the American board again? So my apologies. You gotta love virtual. You know, everything gets out there super quick. So sorry about that. Sorry for any inconvenience. And Christelle, back to you.
Yeah, sure. We have one more discussion question, and then we have a final poll for all of you, and then we'll get wrapped up. So, what were the trade-offs of using a toolkit process? Zane or Abby, did either of you want to start this one?
Sure, I can speak about that. This is Zane. I think the emphasis on the need to balance cycle and a process of research and really thinking about intentional design and development and engagement, while also and recognizing that it's not just a method, but also recognizing the value of developing tools and resources to support learning that really brings the ideas alive. So while it's not just a method, having an opportunity to use the research and to support a process that is grounded in the content. So the tension there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Abby, did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to this one. I think in this case there were just a lot of benefits because it was such a different and more creative process than what city staff are normally used to in terms of rolling out a new set of protocols. So I'd say that differentiating this work with the toolkit was a really positive thing and gave them some really tangible tools. So I don't know, in this example, I don't know if there were any negative trade-offs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thinking of Elk Grove, I think what we learned there was that, you know, the trade-off was to the question that we had about sort of reliability of the data. That really is the trade-off. Is in this case was realizing that some of the folks going out and conducting the research were biased and they had their own desires for how that outcome would look. And maybe that, maybe we got a little bit of skewing of the data from that. I don't think it was considerable, but I would say that the benefit of the process of really earning the trust of that community and giving them the power really to engage in the process in the way that made them feel comfortable and feel like they were sure that the outcome was something that they had literally heard from their neighbors, and that the community was really aligned on what they were telling the city, was really worth that little bit of maybe skew in the data. So.
It sounds pretty interesting. I mean, you're almost creating champions of the people that you're sending out there to work with the toolkits. I mean, they get to hear from themselves directly what they're hearing. It's always great to have other champions other than the practice people.
Yeah, and they really are the people that are the true champions. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our participants has raised her hand, and that's Amy Kane. Amy, I've opened up your mic, so I'm not sure if you had wanted to ask a question directly, but your mic's open. And
I did not.
You did not. Okay.
No, that was an accident. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thanks, Amy. So let's go to that last poll question, because I think that's what you'd wanted to do, Christelle.
Yeah.
So the last question is, do you plan to use a P2 toolkit in the future? Have you been convinced of the benefits? So let's hear what people have to say. All right, Drew, let's close that. Wow, 96% yes and 4% no. Wow, that's super impressive. That's really excellent. I just want to sincerely thank Christelle and Abby and Zane. Christelle, is there anything else that you want to share with the group before we start to close out?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating and welcome you all to get in touch with us. I have our emails here up on the screen, and we'd love to continue the dialogue and welcome you to reach out with any questions you have for us about the content, to get input, to share things that you've done. If you didn't feel like speaking to the group on the webinar, that's totally fine. But if you have examples of times that you've used toolkits or ones that you've seen elsewhere, we'd love to hear from you and really just continue cultivating this community of practice outside of the IAP2 conferences.
Yeah, well, it's great to have this kind of conversation. We've got a couple of comments that have just come in. One from Anne. With regard to bias, whatever we do isn't bias-free either. In my experience, this kind of approach yields so much more and better content than the quality goes up on all fronts, along with all other benefits already noted. So you've definitely got a fan out there with Anne. And from Kieran, it's just that I'm not convinced, just not sure when or how to use this at the moment. So that may be some of our no response. So it wasn't a negative, it was just not quite sure how to use it. And other people just saying, great webinar, really enjoyed it. So a very big thank you to Christelle, Abby, and Zane. Just a quick reminder what's coming up next month. We're going to hear from the winners of the Core Value Awards for Respect for Diversity, Inclusion, and Culture, the EcoPlan International, which worked with the village of Alert Bay and the Numgees First Nation on Vancouver Island to develop a community plan for the small island that they've shared for decades. The St. Paul Public School District, which needed to upgrade its facilities to suit the needs of learners in the 21st century. That's going to happen on Tuesday, March the 14th at the usual time, 2 p.m. Eastern at 11 a.m. Pacific. And in Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra, that's Wednesday the 15th. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, at 5 a.m. And we really do have people that join us that early. It's been a real pleasure having all of you join us today for our monthly learning webinar. I hope you have taken tips and tricks and tools and everything else that you can subsequently use in your own practice. As mentioned, Drew will be getting information out to you within the next 24 hours. And for those of you, hopefully you've all seen the call for submissions for our Denver conference coming up September 6th to the 8th in Denver, Colorado. And I love the fact that Zane brought something she wanted to try to the community so that we could try it out. Think about that. I think that's wonderful. You're going to have about 300 colleagues from around the world at the conference in Denver, and this would be a great way for you to try something out. So we encourage you to do that. So any last thoughts from Zane or Abby or Christelle?
Thank you very much.
Terrific. With that, we're going to bring this session to a close and just say thank you. We hope you have a great day. And by the way, happy Valentine's Day. All the best.